Human pulled an alien girl from the tide, but her calm question later deepened everything. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. It was a stormy afternoon, with the sea crashing violently against the rocks as John Carter trudged down the shore, his boots sinking into the wet sand with each step. His mind was elsewhere, lost in thoughts of the upcoming mission, when a distant cry cut through the roar of the waves. He turned sharply, his instincts kicking in, his eyes scanning the beach. His heart skipped a beat as he saw her, a girl, struggling to stay afloat amidst the wild tide. Without a second thought, John raced toward the water, the wind biting at his skin, the sea spray stinging his face. The waves were unforgiving, pulling her deeper into the abyss with each passing moment. John's heart pounded in his chest as he lunged into the water, his arms cutting through the cold waves as he fought against the current. He reached her just in time, grabbing her arm and pulling her towards him, his muscles straining with the effort. Her skin was an odd shade of blue, unlike anything he had ever seen before, and her long, silver hair floated around her like a halo in the water. She was weak, barely conscious, but there was an undeniable strength in her eyes. John hoisted her onto the shore, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he collapsed beside her. She coughed weakly, the seawater spilling from her lips as her eyes fluttered open. There was a moment of silence as she looked at him, confusion and gratitude mingling in her gaze. "You saved me," she whispered hoarsely, her voice unlike any language John had ever heard. John smiled, though it was faint, as he wiped the water from his face. "You're welcome," he said, his voice gruff but kind. He hadn't expected this. An alien, stranded in the surf, and yet, there she was, breathing, alive. As he checked her pulse and her condition, he noticed how her eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, her skin shimmering under the wetness of the sea. There was an aura of mystery about her, something otherworldly that John couldn't quite place. "I don't know how to repay you," she murmured, her voice steadier now, though her body trembled from the cold. John looked at her, studying her face, the deep blue of her skin, the way she seemed so different, yet so human in her expressions. "You don't have to," he said softly. "I just did what anyone would do." Her eyes met his, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something else, a question, a curiosity that lingered in the air between them. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her tone calm but tinged with something deeper. John hesitated for a moment, his brow furrowing. "I don't know," he said slowly, his voice quiet. "Maybe because it felt right." She studied him intently, as though searching for something in his gaze, something she couldn't quite understand. The wind howled around them, but it felt like time had stopped. She opened her mouth to speak, but then closed it again, as though the words didn't come easily. Finally, she spoke. "I don't belong here," she said, her voice calm yet heavy with meaning. John frowned, unsure of what she meant. "Where are you from?" he asked, his voice gentle. She didn't answer right away, her eyes shifting to the horizon as if looking for something, or someone. The answer, whatever it was, seemed to be something she wasn't yet ready to share. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you." And for the first time, John felt the weight of her words. It wasn't just gratitude he sensed. It was something more, something that would pull them both into a journey neither of them had anticipated. And with that simple question, her words deepened everything, leaving John with a feeling that something had just begun, something that would change both of their lives forever. John helped Liana to her feet, offering her the warmth of his jacket as the wind continued to bite at their exposed skin. The storm had subsided somewhat, but the air was still bitter cold. Liana looked at him, her violet eyes, searching his face with a mix of curiosity and something else, something deeper that John couldn't quite decipher. As she slowly straightened, still shivering from the cold, she glanced around at the desolate beach, the sea now calm but imposing. John noticed the way her movements were graceful despite her exhaustion, like someone who had learned to adapt to the harshest of conditions. "Thank you," she said again, this time with more intensity, her voice soft but clear. John nodded, though he still didn't understand why she was so different from anyone he had met before. "You're welcome," he replied, his tone steady. "But you really shouldn't be out here alone." Liana looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "I wasn't alone," she said quietly. "I was waiting for something." Her words hung in the air, carrying an unspoken weight that John couldn't ignore. He tilted his head slightly, trying to understand. "Waiting for what?" he asked, though part of him already knew that she wouldn't answer him fully. Liana glanced at him, her lips pressing into a thin line as if she were deciding how much to share. After a moment, she spoke again, her voice tinged with something like regret. "For someone who wouldn't come," she said softly, almost to herself. John's curiosity deepened, but he didn't push. There was something about her, an air of mystery, a sense of sorrow that was hard to ignore. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. Liana shook her head, her silver hair swaying like a curtain in the breeze. "No," she answered simply. "I'm not." There was a long silence between them, the kind that was filled with unspoken questions and hesitant answers. John could tell that she wasn't ready to reveal everything, and he respected that. "Well, for now, I suggest we get somewhere warmer," he said with a smile. "You look like you could use a good rest." Liana didn't respond immediately, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, something that softened as she looked at him. "I'll follow you," she said, her voice quieter now, almost hesitant. As they walked together toward the small shelter John had noticed further up the shore, he couldn't help but think about how strange this encounter had been. He had saved her from the waves, yes, but something about her. The way she held herself, the way her eyes seemed to see more than they let on, made him feel like he had just stumbled into something much bigger than he had anticipated. As they reached the shelter, a modest structure that John had built for times like these, Liana hesitated at the door. "It's just a place to stay for now," John said, glancing at her. "You're welcome to rest here." She nodded but didn't enter immediately. Instead, she stood there, looking at him with that same intensity, as if weighing something in her mind. "Why did you save me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "I don't know," he said after a moment. "It just felt right." Liana seemed to consider this, her eyes softening slightly. "Humans are strange," she murmured. John laughed softly. "Tell me about it," he replied, trying to lighten the mood. But as Liana stepped into the shelter, John couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was only the beginning of something far more complicated, something that neither of them fully understood yet. The warmth of the shelter wrapped around them as John closed the door behind them, shutting out the chill of the night. Liana had settled onto the small cot near the back of the room, her delicate frame curled in the blankets he had provided. John busied himself with setting up a small fire in the corner of the room, the soft crackle of the flames filling the otherwise quiet space. He glanced at her occasionally, still wondering about the strange circumstances that had brought them together. The storm outside was still fierce, but here in the shelter, it felt as though time had slowed down. He had been expecting a quiet night, a brief respite from his usual life, but now that Liana was here, everything seemed different. He couldn't quite place why, but he had the unsettling feeling that the answers to his questions were as vast and mysterious as the ocean they had just crossed. Liana's eyes were closed, but he could see the faint tremble in her shoulders as if she was still processing what had happened. The trauma of being caught in the tide, of nearly losing her life, was still fresh. John walked over to her, crouching down beside the cot. "You all right?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Liana's eyes fluttered open, and she looked at him with an expression that was unreadable at first. Her gaze was intense, like she was studying him, trying to make sense of this strange human who had saved her. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady but distant. "Thank you for helping me." John gave a small nod, but his mind was still racing. "You don't have to thank me. It's what anyone would have done." He paused, then added, "But you're not from here, are you?" Liana's gaze softened slightly, her eyes darkening with something John couldn't quite read. She shook her head slowly, as if weighing her words carefully. "No, I'm not." There was a long silence between them, and John could sense that she was holding something back, something important. "Where are you from?" he asked, his voice gentle but curious. Liana took a deep breath before answering. My world is far from here, she said quietly. It's a place where the skies burn bright and the land is endless. But it's not a place I can return to. John raised an eyebrow, intrigued. Why not? Liana hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the edge of the blanket. Because it's not safe anymore, she replied. My people, they're gone. Lost in a war we couldn't win. Her voice cracked slightly, and John could see the pain in her eyes. He had seen this kind of sorrow before, but there was something different about the way Liana carried it. It wasn't just the loss of her people. It was something more personal, something deeper. I'm sorry, John said, his voice low. He didn't know what else to say. Liana looked away, her gaze drifting to the small fire in the corner. I didn't ask for this, she said softly, more to herself than to John. I didn't ask to be saved. I just wanted to find peace. Her words lingered in the air, heavy with the weight of everything she had lost. John didn't know what to say to that. How could he understand her pain when his life had been so different? He had his own struggles, his own battles, but they were nothing like what she had faced. I don't know if I can give you peace, he said after a moment, his voice quiet, but I can offer you safety. For now. Liana turned her head to look at him, her expression softening slightly. I don't know what the future holds, she said, her voice barely a whisper. But I don't think I'm supposed to be here. I don't think I'm supposed to be anywhere. John couldn't help but feel the weight of her words. He had always believed in second chances, in redemption, but Liana didn't seem to believe in any of that. For her, the future was a vast, empty void, and nothing could fill it. He didn't know how to help her, but he couldn't just leave her to face it alone. Maybe we can figure it out together, he said quietly, his voice full of a sincerity that surprised even him. Liana studied him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as if trying to find some trace of deception. But all she found was the quiet determination of a man who had no answers, only the will to try. Maybe, she said softly. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows across the walls, and for the first time since they had met, there was a fragile sense of peace between them. John didn't know what the future would bring, but in that moment, he knew that he couldn't just let Liana slip away into the unknown. Not without trying to help her find a way forward. John woke up early the next morning, the soft crackle of the fire still lingering in the air. The storm outside had passed, leaving behind a quiet, calm world. The sun had begun to rise, casting long shadows across the sandy shore. He stretched his arms, the muscles in his back aching slightly from the rough night. As he glanced over at the cot where Liana had been sleeping, he noticed she was already awake, sitting by the window, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Her figure, delicate yet strong, stood out against the backdrop of the early morning sky. She looked like someone lost in thought, as though she was waiting for something or someone. John approached quietly, not wanting to disturb her, but also curious about the thoughts swirling in her mind. You're up early, he said gently, his voice breaking the silence between them. Liana didn't turn to face him right away, but after a moment, she spoke. I couldn't sleep, she said quietly, her tone distant. Too much on my mind. John nodded, understanding more than she probably realized. Yeah, I get that, he said. Sometimes it's hard to shut everything out. Liana looked at him then, her violet eyes meeting his with an intensity that made him pause. You don't understand, she said, her voice tinged with a sadness that cut through the air like a knife. I don't belong here. I never did. John felt a knot tighten in his chest at her words. He had always believed in second chances, in redemption, but the way Liana spoke made it clear that she didn't feel the same way. You're here now, he said, his voice steady but filled with a quiet conviction. And that's all that matters right now. Liana shook her head slowly, her silver hair catching the light of the rising sun. You don't get it, she whispered. You don't know what I've lost. What my people lost. John moved closer to her, crouching down so he was at her eye level. Maybe I don't know what you've lost, he said softly. But I do know what it's like to feel like you don't belong. To feel like the world doesn't want you. Liana's eyes softened, and for the first time, John saw a flicker of hope behind the sadness. You felt that way too? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. John nodded. Yeah, he replied. I've been there. I still fight that feeling sometimes. The silence between them stretched for a moment, both of them lost in their thoughts. The wind had picked up slightly, and the sound of the waves crashing against the shore was calming in its own way. I don't know what to do, Liana said after a while, her voice quiet, as though she were speaking more to herself than to him. I don't know how to move forward. John sat down beside her, his shoulder brushing against hers. You don't have to have it all figured out, he said, his voice calm and reassuring. You just have to take it one step at a time. Liana turned to look at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty, but also a hint of trust. And what about you? She asked. How do you keep moving forward? John smiled, a faint but genuine smile. I don't always have the answers, he said. But I keep going because I have to. Because someone has to. There was a pause, and for the first time since they met, Liana seemed to relax, her tense shoulders easing just a little. Thank you, she said quietly, her voice soft but full of meaning. John didn't say anything in response. He didn't need to. The moment was enough. It was a fragile connection, but it was a connection nonetheless. And in that moment, John realized that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to move forward together. John woke up early the next morning, the dim light of dawn creeping through the small cracks in the shelter's walls. The sound of waves crashing softly against the shore was a comforting reminder that the storm had passed. He rose from his makeshift bed, stretching his arms and taking a deep breath. His mind still lingered on Liana's words from the night before. The quiet sadness in her voice had stuck with him, and he couldn't help but wonder what kind of life she had led before all of this. As he moved about the shelter, gathering his things, he noticed Liana still sleeping, her silver hair splayed across the pillow like a halo. She looked peaceful, but there was a vulnerability to her, one that John couldn't shake. He didn't know what she had been through, but he felt a growing desire to protect her, to help her find her place in this strange world. After a few moments, he decided to let her rest for a while longer. There was no rush, and maybe, just maybe, some time to herself would give her the space to process everything that had happened. He stepped outside to gather some firewood, the cold morning air biting at his skin, but it felt good, refreshing. The quiet of the beach was almost surreal after the chaos of the storm. He set about his task, the rhythmic sound of his movements grounding him. As he knelt down to gather another branch, a soft voice broke through the stillness. You didn't have to leave. John turned to see Liana standing in the doorway of the shelter, her figure framed by the warm glow inside. She looked a little better than she had the night before, though there was still an air of exhaustion about her. He stood up, brushing his hands off on his pants. I thought you could use some rest, he said, his tone light. Liana stepped outside, the soft crunch of the sand beneath her feet punctuating the moment. She was barefoot, but there was a grace to the way she moved, even in the unfamiliar surroundings. I'm not used to being helped, she said quietly, her voice laced with something deeper than simple gratitude. It feels strange. John nodded, understanding more than she knew. I get that, he replied. Sometimes it's hard to accept help, especially when you're used to doing everything on your own. There was a long silence between them, the sound of the waves filling the space. Liana looked out at the horizon, her eyes distant. I didn't ask for this, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't ask to be saved. John's heart tightened at her words, but he didn't say anything at first. He didn't have the answers, and he knew she wasn't looking for some grand speech about fate or destiny. Instead, he simply took a step toward her, offering her the firewood he had gathered. You don't have to ask for it, he said softly. Sometimes things just happen. Liana's gaze shifted to the firewood in his hands, then back to his face. For a moment, their eyes locked, and John could see the faintest flicker of trust in her expression. Maybe, she murmured. She accepted the firewood without a word and walked back into the shelter, her movements more deliberate now, more at ease. John watched her for a moment before following her inside. The shelter was small, but it was enough to keep them safe for now. The fire crackled in the corner, casting warm light on the walls, and for the first time since they had met, there was a sense of calm between them. Liana sat down on the cot again, her gaze turned inward. John didn't push her to talk. He simply sat across from her, allowing the silence to settle. He could feel the tension easing, though it wasn't gone completely. They both had a long way to go, but in this moment, it felt like they were no longer strangers. Liana broke the silence after a while, her voice soft. What happens now? She asked, her eyes meeting his. John thought about that for a moment. I don't know, he said honestly. We take it one day at a time. Whatever comes next, we'll figure it out. For the first time, Liana offered him a small smile, a glimmer of something hopeful in her eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for John, that was enough. The days passed slowly in the shelter, each one blending into the next as John and Liana adapted to their new reality. The beach was still a peaceful place, with the waves rolling in and out rhythmically, almost like the earth itself was breathing. Despite the quiet, the weight of Liana's past hung over them both, and though they never spoke of it directly, John could feel it every time he looked at her. She was a mystery, a puzzle he didn't know how to solve, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was supposed to be part of her journey, no matter how uncertain that path seemed. Liana was beginning to open up, but it was in small ways. She would share bits of her world, fragments of memories that slipped out during quiet moments. It wasn't much, but it was enough to let John know that, perhaps, she was starting to trust him. One morning, as the sunlight filtered softly through the shelter, John woke to find Liana standing at the entrance, gazing out at the horizon. The sound of the wind had picked up, and the waves were crashing against the rocks in the distance. He stepped up beside her, his movements quiet so as not to disturb her. "Beautiful morning," he said, trying to break the silence. Liana turned her head slightly, giving him a small nod. "Yes," she replied, her voice soft, almost contemplative. "I haven't seen a sunrise like this in a long time." John glanced at her, wondering what it was about the sunrise that made her voice so distant. "Where are you from, Liana?" he asked gently. Though he had asked before, the question felt different now, like it carried more weight. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked out over the water, as though gathering her thoughts. "A place far from here," she said at last, her voice tinged with sadness. "A place where the sky is always bright, where the sun never sets." It was peaceful, before everything changed. John stood beside her, letting her words hang in the air between them. He could sense that this place she spoke of held more than just memories. It held her past, her loss, her reasons for being so distant. "You don't have to tell me everything," he said, his voice soft and understanding. "But I want you to know that you're not alone here. Whatever you've been through, we'll face it together." Liana turned to face him, her violet eyes searching his face for something. She seemed to be weighing his words, considering them more deeply than he had anticipated. "I've never been good at relying on others," she admitted, her voice quieter now, almost fragile. "I've always been independent. But this world, this place, it's different." John nodded slowly, understanding that it wasn't just the alien nature of her world that made her feel out of place. It was the burden of isolation, the weight of a past she couldn't escape. "I get it," he said. "It's hard to trust when you've been through so much. But trust takes time, and I'm not going anywhere." Liana seemed to consider this, her gaze softening slightly. After a long moment, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said, the words carrying an emotion John hadn't expected. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, something that touched him in a way he couldn't explain. "You don't need to thank me," he replied, his voice steady but warm. "I'm just doing what feels right." There was a brief silence, a quiet understanding between them, and for the first time since their paths had crossed, John felt like he had made some kind of breakthrough with her. They weren't just two strangers anymore. They were two people who had found something in each other that neither expected. And while the future was still uncertain, in that moment, it felt like they were no longer alone. As they stood together, looking out over the ocean, John realized that the connection between them was just beginning, and whatever came next, he was ready to face it alongside Liana. The days blurred into one another as John and Liana settled into an unspoken rhythm in the shelter. The beach remained calm, and the world outside their small refuge felt distant, almost forgotten. The mornings were spent in quiet contemplation, and the afternoons passed with simple tasks, collecting firewood, repairing small items in the shelter, or tending to the fire. Yet, as the days went by, John could feel something shifting between them. It was subtle at first, a glance, a shared moment of silence, but it was there. Liana was still distant, her mind often drifting to places John couldn't reach, but she was no longer as guarded. Slowly, she began to open up, not just with her words, but with her actions as well. One afternoon, as John was checking the fire, he heard her speak, her voice softer than usual. "I've been thinking about what you said," she began, her eyes fixed on the horizon. About trust and moving forward. John glanced over at her, noting the change in her tone. She seemed different, less burdened somehow. And, he asked, though he already had an inkling of what she might say. Liana turned to face him, her violet eyes meeting his with an intensity that took him by surprise. I think I'm starting to believe that maybe I can trust you, she said, her voice steady. Maybe I can start to believe in something again. John's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't show it. Instead, he smiled, a smile that reached his eyes and softened the hard edges of his face. That's all I can ask for, he said quietly. Liana nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. For a moment, the air between them felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. But the silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was a shared understanding, a mutual acknowledgement of the progress they had made. As the days continued to pass, the connection between them deepened. It wasn't something they spoke about directly, but it was there, in the way their eyes met when they shared a quiet moment or the way they worked together without needing to say a word. John had always believed in the power of human connection, but with Liana, it felt different. She wasn't just an alien from another world. She was someone who had seen loss, who had faced unimaginable hardship, and yet here she was, still fighting, still holding on. John couldn't help but admire her strength. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Liana spoke again, her voice thoughtful. Do you ever think about what comes next? She asked, her gaze flickering to the flames. What happens after we leave this place? John hesitated, considering her question. It was a question he had asked himself many times, but the answer was never clear. I think about it, yeah, he said slowly. But the truth is, I don't know. All I know is that we'll take it one step at a time, and we'll figure it out together. Liana looked at him then, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand the depth of his words. Together, she repeated, almost as if the word itself carried more weight than she had expected. John smiled again, this time with more certainty. Yeah, together. The fire crackled softly as the night deepened, and for the first time, Liana seemed at peace. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. As they sat in silence, the connection between them grew stronger, and John knew, deep down, that no matter what lay ahead, they would face it together. Whatever the future held, they would face it side by side. The days grew warmer as spring began to settle over the beach, and with it came a sense of change. The air was filled with the scent of salt and fresh growth, the kind of peacefulness that John had forgotten could exist. He had grown used to the quiet, the solitude of his life before Liana had arrived. But now, as they shared the days in the small shelter, something had shifted. They were no longer two strangers brought together by circumstance. They had become something more, companions, friends, maybe even something deeper. John had always thought he understood loneliness, but Liana had shown him a different side of it, one that wasn't just about being physically alone, but about carrying a burden too heavy for anyone to bear. Her past was a shadow that followed her, and even as she allowed herself to open up more, there were still moments when it felt like she was retreating back into herself. Yet, over time, John could see glimpses of the strength she carried, the strength that had brought her this far, even when everything seemed to be against her. One morning, as John worked on repairing the small shelter, he heard her voice from behind him. I've been thinking, she said, her tone serious. John paused in his work, turning to face her. About what? He asked. Liana hesitated, looking at the ground before meeting his eyes. About what comes next, she said softly. I've spent so much time running from my past. I've never really thought about the future. But maybe it's time. John's heart swelled with something he couldn't quite name. He had seen her fight against the pain of her past, and hearing her speak so openly about the future felt like a breakthrough. You don't have to have everything figured out, he said gently, his voice steady. But it's good to think about what's next, even if it's just taking one small step at a time. Liana nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling between them. I don't know where that step will take me, she admitted. But maybe I can start to find a way forward. John smiled softly, his eyes warm. You're not alone in this. Whatever comes next, we'll face it together. Liana studied him for a long moment, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite read. Then, without a word, she stepped closer, her presence more tangible than ever before. For a moment, the world around them seemed to fall away, leaving just the two of them standing in the quiet of the beach, the soft sound of the waves providing a gentle soundtrack to the moment. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. John nodded, his heart heavy with the meaning behind her words. "Anytime." They stood together in silence for a while, the connection between them deeper than words could express. John didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time, he felt like the path ahead wasn't as uncertain as it had once seemed. Liana wasn't just a stranger he had saved from the tide. She was someone who had become a part of his life, and he realized, with a quiet certainty, that he wasn't ready to let go. And for the first time in a long while, Liana seemed to believe that she didn't have to face whatever came next alone. The days turned into weeks, and John and Liana grew more accustomed to each other's presence. The small shelter became their world, a place of quiet refuge from the vast, unknown world beyond. The beach was still their constant companion, with the soft rhythm of the waves against the shore offering a peaceful soundtrack to their lives. The mornings were spent working together, gathering what they needed to survive: food, firewood, and simple tools. As the weather grew milder, their routine shifted, with Liana beginning to take a more active role in their daily tasks. She had always been resourceful, and John admired her ability to adapt, even in a world so different from her own. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the water, John sat by the fire, staring into the flickering flames. Liana was sitting beside him, her gaze fixed on the ocean, her expression thoughtful. It was in moments like this, when the world around them seemed to pause, that John found himself reflecting on how much had changed since that stormy day when he had first pulled Liana from the tide. She had come into his life unexpectedly, and now, as he looked at her, he realized how deeply she had become a part of it. "Do you ever think about what happens after all of this?" Liana asked, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, almost hesitant. John turned to her, surprised by the question. "You mean, after we leave this place?" he asked, his brow furrowing slightly. Liana nodded, her eyes still on the horizon. "Yeah," she said quietly. "I think about it sometimes. What comes after we leave here, after we figure things out?" John paused, the question lingering in the air between them. He had been so focused on the present, on helping Liana heal, that he hadn't given much thought to the future. "I guess," he began slowly, "I don't know exactly what comes after. But I think we'll find a way. We'll figure it out together." Liana turned to look at him then, her violet eyes meeting his with an intensity that made his heart skip a beat. There was something in her gaze, something that spoke of vulnerability, of hope, and of a trust that had been slowly built over time. "I think I'm starting to believe that," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "That maybe we can figure it out, together." John smiled, a warm, genuine smile that reached his eyes. It was a simple smile, but it felt like a promise that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. Liana gave him a small smile in return, a quiet acknowledgement of the unspoken bond they had formed. It was a moment of peace, a moment of understanding, and for the first time in a long while, John felt certain that he wasn't alone. Neither of them had all the answers, but together, they would navigate whatever came next. As the night deepened and the stars began to twinkle above them, John and Liana sat in comfortable silence, their hearts aligned in a way that words could not express. In that moment, the world beyond the beach seemed distant, and the only thing that mattered was the quiet promise they had made to each other, to face the future together, no matter what it might bring.